A 10-year-old king sits at the head of a feast. Across the table, two brothers laugh and eat, completely unaware they've already been sentenced to die. Within the hour, they'll be dragged out into the courtyard below, and the king himself, the one person in the room with the power to stop it, won't be able to say a word that matters. This dinner wasn't a celebration. It was a trap, years in the making, dressed up as an act of goodwill, and it's still remembered as one of the most brutal betrayals in Scottish history. Edinburgh Castle sits on top of an extinct volcano, its walls rising almost straight out of rock, towering over the city that grew up around it. It's one of the oldest fortified places in Europe. By the time our story takes place, kings had ruled up here for centuries. In November 1440, inside those walls, two of Scotland's most powerful teenagers were about to be murdered by the very men who had invited them in as their guests. 3 years earlier, Scotland's king had been assassinated, leaving the throne to his 6-year-old son, James II. A child obviously can't run a kingdom, so a group of regents ruled in his name, and two men in particular ended up fighting over who really held the power. William Crichton, the custodian of Edinburgh Castle, and Alexander Livingston, who controlled the king himself out at Stirling Castle. Normally, these two despised each other, but there was one thing they agreed on completely. The Douglas family had gotten too big to control. At just 16 years old, William Douglas had inherited the title of 6th Earl of Douglas. More land, more soldiers, arguably more real power in Scotland than the boy king sitting on the throne. To Crichton and Livingston, that made William a problem that needed solving. So, for once, the two rivals worked together and came up with a solution. Invite him to dinner. William and his younger brother David received a royal invitation to dine with the king at Edinburgh Castle. On paper, it looked like exactly what Scotland needed. A real chance for the Crown and the Douglases to patch things up after years of tension. The brothers rode in with only a small escort, leaving the safety of their own fortresses behind them, and walked straight into the Great Hall. For a while, it genuinely looked like nothing more than a feast. Wine, food, music, the young king seated at the head of the table. By most accounts, James and William actually got along that evening. For a few hours at least, it must have felt like the beginning of peace. Then, according to the accounts passed down by later chroniclers, a servant carried in a black bull's head and sat it down on the table directly in front of William. In Scotland at the time, that symbol meant only one thing: a sentence of death already decided. The hall went silent. Before William or David could react, armed men seized both of them. The king, a 10-year-old boy who, by some accounts, had genuinely warmed to William just hours earlier, reportedly begged for their lives. He was ignored. A rushed trial followed, almost immediately, on charges of treason that historians still can't fully verify to this day. The brothers were dragged out into the castle yard and beheaded within the hour, in front of the same king they'd just been sharing a meal with only moments before. It's worth being upfront here. Some of the most dramatic details, the bull's head, the rush trial, come from later chroniclers who likely embellished the story as it got retold over the generations. What we know for certain is simpler, and honestly just as damning. Two young nobles were invited to Edinburgh Castle under a promise of goodwill and were dead within the day. An old rhyme about the event survived for centuries afterwards, cursing the castle itself for what happened inside it that night. Here's the twist. The murders didn't actually break the Douglases' family's power. Control of the earldom simply passed to an older relative, and within a few years, the Douglases were arguably stronger than before. The exact outcome Crichton and Livingston had killed 2 teenagers to prevent. James II spent much of the rest of his reign trying to deal with the family he'd once watched executed in his own castle yard. Centuries later, the story became so infamous, it's said to have partly inspired the Red Wedding in Game of Thrones. Today, you can still walk through Edinburgh Castle and stand on roughly the same ground where it happened, one of the world's most visited castles, built on top of one of its own darkest nights.